All right, we are back with part two of the family discussion presented by Black Nonbelievers and co-sponsored by the Stifel Free Thought Foundation. I am Mandisa Thomas, founder and president of Black Nonbelievers, as well as your moderator for today's event. Just a reminder, Black Nonbelievers is a nonprofit organization headquartered in the Atlanta, Georgia area that connects with Blacks and allies who are leaving or who are living free of religion and might be otherwise shunned by family members and friends in a caring, friendly, and informative environment. You may visit our website at blacknonbelievers.org for more information and to donate. So if you've been watching, we just completed the first portion of the panel, which featured some amazing guests, and we spoke on the historical and structural factors of Christianity, and white supremacy. And the second segment will focus on the current state of events as well as looking to the future. And for our panelists for this portion, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Sabrina Dent, who is the Senior Faith Advisor for Americans United for Separation of Church and State. She previously worked as the Director of Recruitment and Admissions at the Religious Freedom Center of the Freedom Forum, where she managed several education initiatives designed for religious and civic leaders. A lifelong advocate for human rights and social justice, Dr. Dent has presented at numerous programs and events, including the 2018 Parliament of the World's Religious Conference and Melissa Rogers' Faith in American Public Life book launch on C-SPAN Book TV. Her most recent articles, The Two Big G's, God and Government, and Falwell's latest outburst, underscores the moral imperative of religious freedom, speak the critical importance of addressing church-state issues while acknowledging this historical challenge of religion and religious freedom. Next, we have Dana Roger, who's the CEO of Fibby Music Group, a singer, songwriter, and a musician with a bachelor's degree in music, business, and management, as well as an extensive catalog under his belt. Roger has worked closely with artists such as Grammy Award winner Alicia Keys and many others. Danal is also the lead organizer for the Washington, D.C. affiliate of Black Nonbelievers and has participated in projects with the Religious Freedom Center and the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And last but certainly not least, we have Charles Watson Jr., the Director of Education for the Baptist Joint Committee on Religious Liberty. Hailing from Millen, Georgia, Charles graduated from the Citadel and was then commissioned into the U.S. Air Force. His career has led him to leadership roles as a consultant for DeWolf, Boberg and Associates Incorporated, and he is also on the faculty at the Religious Freedom Center of the Freedom Forum Institute. As a seminary-trained religious liberty advocate and educator, Charles routinely speaks at colleges and houses of worship across the nation. He is also the co-founder of the Ball Watson Community Engagement Foundation. Thank you all once again for joining us for this second panel here. And so we are going to get into the questions. So, similar to the first question that the first panelists were asked, there has been acknowledgement of Christianity as being a major source in establishing white supremacy and racist structures. What has been the most damaging aspects of this to the Black community? And I'm going to start with Dr. Dent.
Yes, Mandisa, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this panel today, as well as I want to thank Black Nonbelievers for this opportunity. One of the things that I would say is probably the most damaging aspect of this to the Black community. It starts with me reflecting on a quote by Angela Davis in her book when she wrote about freedom is a constant struggle. She talked about how racism is so deeply entrenched in the structures of society and that it requires that we look beyond just individual acts of racism and we actually look at systems. And so a lot of times people overlook the systems that are happening or the work that needs to be done systemically. So with that, I think about specifically this current administration. I think it's very problematic when you have an elected government official to then stand in front of a church, St. John's Church, to hold up a Bible and proclaim himself, to proclaim this authoritative figure in the United States, which he is representative of because he has the label of president. But just before that, he had just stated himself to be the commander or the president of law and order. And so that was a threat against the protesters that were out there fighting for their lives, but also Black and brown bodies and marginalized communities. So, what does it mean to have the president of the United States, which the United States is not, it was not founded as a Christian nation, to stand in his official capacity and hold up a Bible? What does that say to people who are citizens of the United States who are non-religious? What does that say to people in the United States that have different religious identities? And so, as I say that, I also think about the moral injury that happens when you think about how religion and the Bible has been used to condone slavery and acts of violence, whether you're talking about in the historical context as well as when you're talking about immigration. And so, even to that note, I would say, even thinking about how Jeff Sessions used Romans 13 to really condone like the separation of children from their families at the borders. Now, how does this intersect with the Black community? A lot, because we have to recognize that Black people are non-religious as well as religious, that Black people come from many different places, and that people that were detained at the borders weren't just from Mexico, they were from many different countries. And so when we think about this systemically, the message that it sends out to our community as it pertains to racism and racist structures, it basically sends a message of this white supremacist way of thinking and ideologies that seeks to dehumanize and disempower communities of color. And so for me, that's the point at which I enter this conversation and thinking about how this damages our community.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dent. We are going to move on to Charles.
Melissa, thank you again for inviting me to this conversation. I would say the biggest thing has been the devaluing of Black bodies by Christianity. When you even think of Jesus being on the cross, when you think of people actually seeing a white Jesus, as was talked about in the previous panel, and their value system being attached to that. Dr. James Combs talked about in his book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. And when you think about the Black bodies that we've seen from whether it's police brutality or even government sanctioned violence against Black bodies, I think the imagery of Jesus has played a part in that, because if our European Americans would see Jesus as being more than white, then maybe they could see the violence that has been portrayed against us in a different light. But because they don't see Jesus as being anything but a white savior, then they can't connect the dots of saying, wait a minute, I think about Alton Sterling in New Orleans, in Louisiana, and in his death, talking about Eric Garner, seeing these people that were actually, if you think about it, they were put to death, sentenced to death, sanctioned to death, just like Jesus was, by government officials, law enforcement. But the one difference is Jesus actually got a trial. These Black bodies, they didn't even, Black individuals didn't even get a trial. So I think Christianity and white supremacy has devalued the human body, the Black body in our society. But the biggest detriment to us in the Black community has been our mental capacity and how it's broken us down as a way of devaluing devaluing how we can make change. I think it was mentioned in the previous panel about the turn the other cheek or the docile aspect of it, and that doesn't always mean violence, but that does mean that, hey, if you have value in yourself and you see your creator in yourself, then you have more value in yourself. It aligns with that. The last thing is you can see it from the manifest destiny aspect of how America has portrayed, especially European Americans, has used Christianity as their manifest destiny. It's like they own everything. They're supposed to come here, colonize, rape, murder, take over land, bring in slaves, and this was their God-given right to do that. And when you have that type of symbolism and have that type of mindset, it can do nothing but cripple the Black community. And unfortunately, we've allowed that to continue. And until Blacks, African Americans of faith, and I talk in this manner because I'm a person of faith, until we stand up and say, no, this isn't Christianity, number one. And number two, hey, just because I claim Christianity doesn't mean I have the corner on being right. I've been wrong so many times that I would have to be humble and have grace. And so until we're able to acknowledge those things, we're still going to be at a detriment to white supremacy and the racial structure that is going on and continues to go on in America.
Thank you very much, Charles. And Roger will close out this question.
Thank you, Mandisa, for having me. And I totally echo the comments that Dr. Dent and Charles just made, as well as the panelists before. I'm similarly situated in my impression of the issue and the effects of our community. I feel that what has been to our detriment is that we've had a lack of a proper addressing of or a reconciliation of the emotional trauma that this entire experience of slavery and post-slavery has been for us in the diaspora. And I think it showed up in a lot of pernicious ways, especially when you think about the African-American community in specific, knowing that we have the largest population or percentage of religious communities in the country as a demographic, and that in that demographic, we have the largest percentage of people who believe in biblical literacy. And so one of the things that flows from the lack of addressing a lot of these issues, I feel, is the lack of, insofar as we're talking about biblical literacy, the lack of biblical scholarship. That's something that has been to our detriment, especially from the position of skeptics and non-believers, whether you are a non-believer or not, just in being skeptical of the Word of God. That can be a very, very difficult wall to hit and a difficult conversation for all of us to have, regardless of our positions. I think we can find that when we talk with our families or when we encounter different ideas that we may have, we find that there's the theme of no room for debate, and that you can have a conversation or you can't have a conversation because there is no room for debate in terms of skepticism or expressing doubts about the identity of or the existence of God. Conflating religiosity with ethnicity and pride. The idea that the skepticism cannot be something that we engage in because this is a part of our ethnicity from day one. I think it plays on the things that we don't have and the things that we haven't addressed as a people emotionally and educationally. And it sort of says that it's all right for us to adopt this narrative unchecked and to hold it and to pass it on, along with all of our other traumas from generation to generation. And it doesn't leave room for us to appreciate the breadth, the truth, and the ugliness of this history when we talk about slavery and slave institutions and systems. As Dr. Sakivu had mentioned in the previous segment, talking about economy and capitalism and rape, misogynoir. Also, when we talk about the other aspects of the diaspora, I'm from the Caribbean. I'm from the U.S. Virgin Islands, which was bought from the Danish, and there's a whole lot of history of our brothers and sisters in the Caribbean that mirrors what we have here in the States, and in some cases can be just as bad or worse. And so really kind of recognizing that breadth of history is something that I think has affected us very poorly. We've got to recognize what we've been through, which requires us to really understand the history in its totality.
Thank you very much, Ro. That was amazing. Uh, Now on to the second question. What do our communities, our Black communities, really need to understand about white supremacy, its religious roots, and how it affects public policy, as well as um, the way we treat each other in our communities, which in turn affects us the most? And I'm going to start this question with Charles.
Thank you for that question, Lisa. I want to first say one more thing about that first question that we really need to drill home. All of us talked about a little bit of the trauma that has been associated with the white supremacy and Christianity, and how that affects us as African Americans, not being able to say we're going to go to get therapy, to go to get counseling, the stigma that comes behind that, because many of us were raised with the idea that Jesus is all you need. Um, we can't have that. We have to be open to other things being able to heal us besides a savior, and be open to the fact that there is life that is here that can be good, not just an afterlife motif that we have. So I wanted to make sure we said that because I'm a big believer in therapy and counseling, and this is a part of where it's a detriment to us as African American community. As far as this question, how public policies, to me, it goes back to still devaluing of the bodies. We still see it in our prison industrial systems. One of the places that I make sure I donate to every year is the Equal Justice Initiative, because I see that how blacks are incarcerated at a higher level for more time for the same crimes. And I think that's a part of the systematic racism and white supremacy that doesn't value our bodies. Because if you take that lineage from what we read in some texts of the Bible, when you don't properly interpret it in that way, it lends itself to saying, oh, these people are this, and they're be below human dignity, and that still plays a part in how African Americans are more likely to receive the death penalty than their European American counterparts, even for the same crimes. You see it play out in the Bible Belt even more. And that's not a coincidence that you have capital punishment in those states that were notorious for beating down of African Americans and also still suppressing votes. All of this still plays into Christianity, and it also still plays into public policy, even to the point of if a religious person is on trial. We had, unfortunately, I think it was 2009, Dominique Ray in Alabama was on death row. His religion, he was a Muslim. He wanted to have his imam there present for him before this sanctioned death that was going on by the government. And they denied that from him because they even tried to give him a chaplain, a Christian chaplain, to be there. Now, I've worked as a chaplain in children's hospital and hospice situations, and there's no replacing somebody's spiritual leader for them. And if they would do that to him, then just think how some person that doesn't have a spiritual faith would be treated in those type of things. So we can't have our policies being catered toward people of faith more than they're catered toward people that don't have a faith tradition. We can't have our policies catered toward people of a certain faith tradition more than they are in a faith tradition that may not be the majority. The final thing I'll say about this, and I want to leave time for Sabrina because I love what she's going to have to say about this. Final thing I say is economically, the churches and the amount of money that they have in these churches pertaining to the land that they own and the endowments that they have and what they've made off of black bodies, and to still be holding on to that financial resource without distributing it out is a crime that's still going on today. And it's a part of the public policy system. I think those churches should really be thinking about reparation, not just from the government. Churches have to think about that too, because it wasn't just the American government and people that were slaveholders that benefited from the terrorizing of black bodies. It was churches that actually were benefiting from those things. And so if they still want to hold on to the money, the monetary means that they were sanctioned to and provided by off of black bodies, then they have to be held accountable in that way too. And that money should be going to our community, go to our banks, and as a part of economic policy as well.
Thank you very much, Charles. Before we move to Sabrina, I'm going to let Ro respond.
Sure. My answer is that when we're talking about these our communities and policy, there's so much of what certainly I studied and what I have experienced in my travels come to find as a thread that goes back to something very, very primal. For example, I read a book called Stolen Legacy by George G.M. James a number of years ago. And there's a quote that I always remembered, which says something to the effect of the theft of the African legacy, leading to an erroneous world opinion that all Africans had made no contribution to civilization and that they were naturally backwards. And that is something that you find throughout the history of policy in all of these countries that we're talking about when we talk about the systems of white supremacy and the systems of the nature of global white dominance, essentially, as it has been implemented in various parts of our life and our society. The threat of inferiority is something that runs far and wide and very deep. We have to really understand that these policies were instituted from I don't want to say day one, but from a very, very long time ago. They are hundreds of years old. They go back to a papal bull from 1455, which authorized the taking of Africans to be slaves based on their backwardness and their barbarism and their savagery, and that was instituted by the Catholic Church, by someone who was acting in a political nature. And these things have been implemented all throughout the Western world, the sub-Saharan world, as they call it, global South, and so forth. So the scope of this economy, the scope of these ideas, the scope of this devaluing of Black life, as Charles just mentioned, is something that is so far and wide. It's hard to really understand or grasp like how many parts of life it has permeated. When I think about more contemporary examples of that, we certainly know the co-opting of Christianity for the purpose of political gain here in this country. Obviously, the GOP is part and parcel for doing such a thing, and they've been doing it for a number of years. I recently watched a documentary about Norma McCorvey. Everybody has probably heard of the Roe versus Wade Supreme Court case, and it was a documentary that was really insightful, and it just kind of rolled back time a little bit to her sort of come to Jesus moment. And so she was the person who brought the case that would be decided in Supreme Court. And she was obviously pro-abortion. She was arguing for the right to have her own. And that at some point down the line, she got saved. And she was essentially paraded around the country to represent the sort of religiosity and the power of salvation and redemption as someone who was anti-abortion. We think about policy and you think about Black women and reproductive rights and the types of caricatures and the characterizations of Black women that have been utilized by the GOP and people who have adopted a white nationalist sort of policy position. And you think about what consequences Black women all over the country had, the races that were won, the political races and primaries that were won using ideas about Black women and hypersexuality and sort of insatiable sexual appetites and the abuse of the reproductive system or rights for their own personal gain, and how many people have been disadvantaged by that kind of policy, and that it would be traced back to a person who the documentary exposes at the end, be traced back to a person who was literally paid to represent her salvation and her turnaround, come to Jesus sort of identity, so that she could basically game the system. That's an example of policy that's impacting negatively on our community, impacting negatively on Black women, impacting negatively on the political aspirations of a whole bunch of other Black politicians who probably couldn't get the same traction out of that argument because they were Black or they were women, or they were fighting another candidate who was using that kind of caricature to win a race. So that's a more contemporary example. Also, I think about Dr. Dent mentioned Trump and his use of the Bible in front of the church a few weeks ago. Also utilized a few weeks ago was the 1807 Insurrection Act, which, if you study the Haitian Revolution, you find out that the Insurrection Act is a response to what happened in Haiti. And what was happening in terms of revolution in general, the French Revolution and so forth, but specifically in Haiti, and the nervousness and the amount of preoccupation that our country's leaders and founding fathers and Congress had about Blacks rebelling and uprooting the slave system, which was an economic system that essentially built this country and helped them out. And they were terrified that folks would be insurrectionists and that they would rebel and that they would essentially buck the system and ruin it for everybody. And so the Insurrection Act being invoked just a few weeks ago as a vestige of the Haitian Revolution is just like amazing. It's an amazing point of history that shows the way policy can be implemented and how its roots go back to inferiority and how economic gain of white people and white supremacy, and specifically utilizing religion. At the same time he was invoking the Insurrection Act, he was holding the Bible. So these things come together and they're hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years old. I think that the last thing I'll say is that all of these things, I feel, skew our comprehension of the problems that we face when we don't recognize them, when we don't gird ourselves in the sort of roots and the history and the ideas behind these things. These ideas, like I said, going back to the Papal Bull of 1455, going back to Christopher Columbus, when he stepped off the boat and met the Arawaks and the Tainos in the Caribbean, he automatically size them up to be slaves and to be savages, and that they would be fit for redemption and Christendom. These are ideas that he literally brought with him on the boat. And when he got off, he wrote these things in his journals. These things were fully formed ideas hundreds of years ago. We cannot not appreciate the reality of how pervasive these things are to this day.
Thank you for that, Ro. And Dr. Dent will have the last word on this question.
Yes. So what I would say to that is what I hear Ro and Charles raising is the question of, for me, whose religious freedom, whose human rights are we talking about? So Charles talked about incarcerated individuals and how Dominic Ray, was given it was basically told he would get a Christian imam for his last rites of passage. And so that is a violation of his religious freedom and his right to do so. And then Ro talked about reproductive justice. Like, I'm glad that Ro mentioned actually that documentary, because that leads to a point that I have, how the religious right and how evangelicals and the Republican Party have used people, have manipulated people to do certain things. So I specifically think about, and I apologize for the language because I don't have another word, but how Black Christian leaders are often used as pawns to send political messages out to their communities about certain issues. And so I think about how specifically with this particular administration, how there have been this convening of Black leaders, Black religious leaders. And keep in mind, the majority of the time is Christian leaders that they're reaching out to. But it happens at a cost to our community. It happens at a cost to religious and non-religious individuals. Also, I want to say, as far as policy is concerned, one of the things that we need to think about more deeply is, Ro talked about reproductive justice. So, the Trump versus Pennsylvania case was decided on. And so with that particular case, a lot of people are like, hands off my birth control. And I'm like, yes, hands off your birth control, but we actually have to center conversations about justice and use the language of reproductive justice in our arguments about religious freedom and what that looks like. So I immediately think about how, we talked about Black women, how from 1845 until 1849, James Marion Sims, who is known as the father of modern day gynecology, performed surgeries on 10 enslaved women without the use of anesthesia, right? And I also think about the fact that he performed 30 surgeries on one enslaved woman. And again, without anesthesia, with this notion that, Black people don't feel pain, or Black women, have this strong threshold for pain. And so when we think about this in terms of as it translates to these particular policies, we have to think about how this impacts communities overall. So when I think about reproductive justice, I also think about people having the right, women having the right to choose to make decisions, not only about their bodies, but about their health, about their families, about having access to not only affordable health care, but adequate places where they can get medical treatment. It also looks like when in 2017, the CDC did a report about maternal mortality, and what they found of the 14 agencies that did voluntarily give information of for, data from their research, they found that 63% of pregnancy-related deaths, 63% of those deaths were preventable. And so it's like when you think about these things, so people want to just talk about, birth control rights, and none of this is superficial. But I think that it's important for us to think about how, as Black women, a lot of times conversations about the issues that deeply impact us are often left off the table for the sake of respectability politics. And I wrote about this recently in a blog that I wrote, and I talked about the religious freedom dilemma and how politics are a threat to reproductive justice. So anytime someone can say, well, let's not talk about this issue because it might ruffle the feathers of one particular group, that they have to remember that disenfranchises another group if we don't discuss this. So I think we have to think about, when we're talking about policy, we have to think about how even religious freedom circles, how immigration circles, all these things impact us. And to that point, one more thing I want to say is that also, again, thinking about the religious right and thinking about the agenda that's happening right now with the Department of Education and Betsy DeVos, and how they're pushing for private school vouchers. Now, I'm not a legal expert on this, but I want people to think about this very critically. And again, how this impacts Black communities. I grew up in Petersburg, Virginia. Petersburg, Virginia is a predominantly African-American city. And I know that my city at times struggles in many ways, financially, as far as the politics that are happening as well. And so when people buy into the messaging that comes from the religious right about supporting religious education or using taxpayer money to fund that, I think about every dollar that does not go to Petersburg public schools. I think about every dollar that goes away from students with disabilities that may be in those communities as well. And so I think for me, people need to think more deeply about the impact and the messaging that goes out from a certain group. And also, who controls the narrative about religious freedom? And are the stories of Black people from many different religious identities, cultural identities, being centered in those discussions? And if they're not, we have a responsibility to do so. And so I know that I've personally made a commitment to do that, but to do that work, especially in the space that I am in. And I'm grateful that AU has given me that space to use my voice to say that. But we have to think deeply about everything that Charles mentioned, everything that Ro mentioned and the panel before, and how that continues to play out. And it only stops once we make a concerted effort, an intentional effort to do so.
Thank you very much, Sabrina, and thank you to everyone for answering that second question so wonderfully. So now we come to the last question for this segment, which is, we see recent polls have shown that Black millennials and younger Black generations are leaving traditional religious belief. They're shedding it. Some are openly identifying as atheists, and more generally as like non-religious. Is the tide of activism changing in our community? And is the Black community ready to accept this and work towards liberation?
Mm.
And Ro, I'm gonna start with you.
Oh well, thank you. I find as an organizer that I have been surprised at the reception that our presence has had in various spaces since I've been involved with BN and specifically BNDC here in the nation's capital. There is definitely an appetite, but it's there's still a tepid kind of nature, I think, to people in the Black community that I encounter at marches and events and advocacy, the venues of advocacy that we're invited to. But I have to say that I have been surprised that although we get some negative feedback, more or less, I find that people are inquisitive, and there is some sense of what the stats that you're mentioning being reflected in the attitudes of people. People do want to understand what a Black non-believer is. People do want to understand that there is a space for people to express skepticism, to work out theological issues that they may not feel comfortable to work out with, in their traditional religious spaces. People do feel a sense of ease and being comforted by the notion that there's someone that they can talk to without judgment. And in my case, as a former minister of music and someone who's worked in ministry for somewhere around 20 years, I can specifically speak to a certain kind of religiosity that I know personally, and the language essentially that people use to discuss these issues. So I think that there is a turning of the tide, but I will temper that by talking about how tepid I think it still is. And so we have a lot of work to do because unfortunately, a lot of our religious institutions, and there are exceptions, but a lot of our religious institutions are not as invested in the scholarship and the education that we've been talking about around these global systems, the economic systems, the effects of all of the various attitudes of inferiority and implementations in policy. A lot of the religious institutions that we are in have a way of talking about that without talking about what's really, really sort of undergirding it all. And so it tends to kind of be rounded down to, you just need a personal relationship. You just need to accept, whatever the proposition is, and you need to enjoy the music. The music will make everything better. The shouting and the carrying on, all of these things can sort of be substitutes for the knowledge that you would otherwise be getting if you were in perhaps a different venue. And so I find myself feeling that when people encounter BN, when they encounter Black folks who are skeptic, who express openly skepticism of religion and who express a defiance about it, I find that they're kind of really hungry for that. They're really interested in those conversations because they don't have a place to discuss those things. And so that's my experience. But like I said, I do think it's going to take some time. I do think that all of the things that we're all doing really help to create a better environment for that conversation to happen.
Thank you very much, Ro. We'll proceed with Dr. Dent.
Yes, I think Rose said something so important there. Relationship is so critical. I think about the relationship, Mandisa, that we've been being able to develop over the last couple of years, or the last year, because it's only been like a year and a half, maybe, that we've developed our relationship and doing this work. And I think what needs to happen, and it's going to happen anyway, is that people need to get used to change. Things are constantly evolving, and as you can see, yes, there is There is a rise of individuals that identify as unaffiliated or religious nuns. And one of the things is I think about my own personal journey to being who I am today. I was raised in a Pentecostal household. At some point, I ended up in the Baptist church, and I was a part of some other religious identities as well. And I simply identify as a person that is spiritual, because what I found in my journey in life is that it was about the relationships. It was about the people that I met along the way that presented a different narrative for what was given to me when I was younger. And that I had a healthy sense of curiosity and the right mind to ask good questions and really align myself with individuals that value the human dignity and worth of every human being. And I think that is important. I think that is critical for anyone to do as far as activism is concerned. If you're not in any particular movement to help humanity, then I really think that you should try to step aside. I think that it's important that we value like the human being and the work that we're doing. And so how does that translate as far as religion and religious identities? I think it's important that Christian spaces and I speak from the Christian perspective because that is part of my foundation, but I think there needs to be a conversation like we're having today, a healthy conversation, asking questions, and then come to some sense of like, how can we find common ground and work together for the greater good of humanity? And so are they ready? Yes and no. I don't know. There are some people that are in traditional religious spaces that are doing incredible progressive work and that are walking alongside people that have different beliefs than their own. And I think that is so important. I think it's fantastic. But I think also those that have traditional values need to spend a little bit more time like exploring the work of Black nonbelievers and other organizations. Even the organization I work for, Americans United, that was founded by religious leaders, but has a huge base of non-religious people that are supporting its work because of the right to protect religious freedom for all and to protect church-state separation. And so, yeah, I think that some people are ready, but here's the thing: things are changing regardless of whether people get with it or not. And so, if you have someone that's in your family that has a different belief system than you, a different identity from you, it's just good to just sit down, have a cup of coffee, and have a conversation. Well, in this moment of social distancing, do it on chat if you have to. But I think it's important that we engage in this healthy dialogue in order for us to move forward and move humanity forward.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dent. We are going to close this out with Charles.
Still there?
Yep.
Can you hear me? Okay,
Yep.
I couldn't see myself on the screen. That's why I didn't know.
Okay, I need to change that.
I can speak to this. I want to speak to this on 3 levels if I can. The first thing I want to say, though, before I even go to those 3 levels is we better get ready for it because there's not enough of us to defeat them to be leaving somebody behind. And when I say them, I mean people that are against the humanity of people who look like us. And so when we start this cancel culture of we're going to cancel this one and leave him alone, leave her alone. No, it's not enough of us to do that. We have to pull them along and they will learn as they go. I think that's a part of what I would say to the culture that doesn't have a religious faith that's a little more woke. I would say, hey, you were always woke. You know what I'm saying? I'm a plant-based person. I'm a vegan. So when I started off, I didn't know everything about being a vegan. I had to have somebody pull me along as I went there. It's the same thing with acknowledging us trying to move ourselves closer to liberation. You weren't always woke like this, so have some grace for those people that aren't there and try to bring them along. And I say that because I look at it in my family. I was blessed to have a big family. My mom was the baby of 12. My dad was the baby of 12. 10 survived on each side. So I had a big family. Most of them were from the South, but many of them are up north now. And my family, while they have the base of Christianity, being raised Baptist and really not knowing what that was, just saying grandma was Baptist, granddad was Baptist, we're going to be Baptist. But we also have people in my family that don't have a faith tradition, and most of them are, my younger cousins, and I love how they are free thinkers in that way. But I also have cousins that are in interracial marriages, which would help me go along with the liberation and understanding. I need to know about these things. The other thing is in the South, it's coming along, but I'm from Millen, Georgia. We have 4 stoplights. If you count the caution light that's there, some of the stuff is not coming along. I'll just be honest with you, because there's an idea of comfortability and not wanting to ruffle feathers, and still being a little bit afraid of what that change looks like and what it actually means. And a part of that comes from what is taught. I have the privilege of speaking with college students as they come into our offices at my job, and many of them are about liberation. But I don't think they're about the liberation of just us. They're about the liberation of many other people. But I want them to know about the liberation of us. But unfortunately, in our K through 12 system, we're not taught about the liberation that came from people like Nat Turner or Denmark Vesey or Fannie Lou Hamer or Prathia Hall, people that are actually fighting with a religious attitude behind them, that actually went to war for us with that religious behind them. We're given just MLK, and then if they give us Malcolm X, they call him radical. We have to have a liberation that understands we've had a past of fighting to get our liberation, and it's okay to continue that path of fighting. It's okay to be a part of Black Panther. It's okay to be a part of Huey Newton, and understanding what those things were about then and still are about now, and being able to bring that together with those who are of a faith tradition and moving this train forward through all of us. And without us bringing us together, like I said at the beginning, we don't have enough of us to fight them. And them can include people that look like us that still are under a European theology of religion, especially if we're talking about Christianity. So my thing is, yes, we can get there, and it's possible, but it's not possible if we're not willing to tell the truth about situations and understand where we've fallen short as people of religion, and where we haven't been able to be critical in thinking. The last thing I'll say about it is, as a person of faith, I've used this thing called the Wesleyan Quadrilateral, and I've worked with it several times, and it speaks to 4 things. It's like a table, and if you let either of them get too high or get too low, the table isn't stable. It brings together scripture, tradition, reason, and experience. Now, for me, scripture can be whatever holds you to your moral and ethical state. And you can read that, and what does it say? Tradition, what has been done in the past, and holding it up. Is that why they did it this way? Why did they do it this way? Reason, God gave us a brain, or even if you don't believe in God, you have a brain, so you can reason and think through stuff. And experience, my personal experience. I used to think like this, but then I had this experience, and I'm like, I don't know. And if you put those 4 things together, I think we can find a liberation that would be helpful for us as a African American community, a Black community, or even a community of the African diaspora all over the place. Give us a unity to work from. That's the place I work from, but everybody doesn't have to work from there. My main point is, we can't leave people behind, whether it's people of religious faith, whether it's people of no faith tradition. We have to work together to form true liberation, especially here in the United States.
All right. Thank you very much for this session of the second half of this discussion. As a family was just as good as the first. I'd like to thank each and every one of you, as well as our viewing audience. It was a pleasure to have you here with us this afternoon. We have come to the end of this discussion, and hopefully we'll be able to do it again, because this isn't just a one-time effort. As we see in our current climate, in our communities, these have to be ongoing. And as times do change, we have to find these ways to continue to work together and build, so that we have a stronger community for ourselves and in the future. So I'd like to give some shout outs at the end. I'd like to thank once again all of our panelists, Dr. Hutchinson, Dr. Butler, Jeremiah Kamara, Dr. Seville, Dr. Dent, Roger, and Charles. I'd also like to thank our moderators on the back end, Bridget Crutchfield, Tina Marshall, and Nick Stancato, as well as a huge thank you to the Steeple Free Thought Foundation for co-sponsoring this event. Once again, and I'd like to thank each and every one of you for watching. Once again, you can follow the work of Black Nonbelievers and subscribe to us on social media. First and foremost, you can visit our website at blacknonbelievers.org. We are on Facebook at Black Nonbelievers. We are on Instagram at B Nonbelievers Inc., Twitter at B Nonbelievers. The B and the N are capitalized. And of course, our YouTube channel at Black Nonbelievers Inc. Please do consider making a tax-deductible donation to Black Nonbelievers. We are a 501c3 organization, and your support does help us with our work. You can visit our website. We are also available on Cash App, and you may also select us as a beneficiary on Amazon Smile. I hope you all have a wonderful evening. This will be available on playback on YouTube. And thank you once again, and be sure to check back in with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.
Yes.